Welcome to the Hueneme Museum. Thank you for all coming today. Today we're going to have past mayor and city council lady Sylvia Munoz, and she's going to talk on a very interesting subject. It's going to be on the Cristero Revolution in Mexico, and we're looking forward to hearing about it.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, and welcome.
Thank you. So before I start, how many in the audience have either heard about the Cristero Revolution or your family members were involved? So if you could raise your hand. So a good number. Wow. Thank you for joining us today. I thank the Port Hueneme Historical Society Museum and all the volunteers that are here in order for me to put on this presentation. And I think I've spoken here, at least this is like my third year. And every time the story changes and it morphs a little bit. And so you get the latest edition when you attend these. But most importantly is I find more and more people in our larger community who have either heard about it, have heard stories about their families. And this morning some photos were shared of grandfathers that were involved in the Cristero Revolution, all the way from Sonora all the way into like central West Mexico, which was where my family is from, and throughout the entire country. So hopefully you'll get some information that allows you to investigate a little further about how your family was involved. This is a story that should not go away. This is a story that should stay in our hearts and minds as well as in our kids and our grandkids. It's a very, very important story, and it talks about just the suffering of the Mexican people during this time, but also too is that we don't want to return to what history was all about. We want to move forward and have the freedoms and really honor and know that it's a privilege to have these freedoms and possibly even fight for them. So here we go. No, that's the pointer, right? So what's this one? Okay. Okay. So for me, this story starts really in 2003. It was a long time ago, 16 years ago. And at that time, both my parents were alive. And my father started to have a few complications with his health. He was in remission from cancer for about 10 years at that time. And he needed to visit the doctor a little bit more. So I had a consulting business. I had the opportunity to take him during the day for all his doctor's visits. And I remember it was a Wednesday night. And I went over to his house with really no intent of actually asking him much, but just helping him file away his papers from the doctor's visits and get the next scheduled things underway. And I stopped and I asked him, "Hey, Dad, what was your mom all about? You know, he never really told me about my grandmother, his mom, because she had passed away when he was about 11 years old." He was the oldest of the first family. He was the oldest of 7 there. And then overall, he was the oldest of 14 kids because my grandfather remarried 5 years after my grandmother died. And so he stopped and told me, "Hey, you know, she was beautiful. She was full of life. She was young. She had a long braid." And just described maybe what she looked like and how her dress was, because they were very traditional and of the ranches of Los Altos de Jalisco. And then the next statement out of his mouth said, "You know, during that time, there was a war between the Federales and the Cristeros." I said, "Wow, you know, I mean, I don't really know much about Mexican history. I was born and raised here. You know, my first trip to Mexico, I was 18. So what is he talking about?" And I stopped and I kind of questioned him and asked him more questions. And the third statement that he released just threw me for a loop. And I said, "Wow, Dad, I really don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to have to ask you more questions. So over the course of about 3 or 4 months, I began to just not necessarily like sit down and interview him, but as he's watching baseball on TV or just going through his daily routine, I'd start asking him questions. And that was until August of that same year. By that time, he didn't want to talk anymore. He just didn't want to share his story anymore. December 7th of that same year, he dies. I'm thinking, wow, you know, he's given me a start to this story. So I start doing some more investigation. I have a cousin who's now a priest in Mexico, and he had done maybe like a dissertation on the Cristero Revolution. So I started asking my cousins, who were primarily from Mexico, hey, tell me what it's all about. And I also did a few trips to Mexico and visited, you know, some of the stomping grounds of my family and the Heritage Ranch and all. And it wasn't until about 2.5 years later I began to write this story. And so the story really starts with me in 2003. But as we go forward each year, there's always so much more that we uncover. So my book is called Abandoned Angels. It's a historical fiction. You might want to say, well, you know, why is it a historical fiction? Well, I've had to incorporate some characters into the story. I didn't necessarily interview anybody directly about this, but only my mom and my dad. And so that's why it's fictionalized. But about 70 to 80% of the story that you will read in my book is based on true story about what happened to our families. As I mentioned, my dad started sharing with me the story. After he passed away, I started to ask my mom a few questions about this time frame, and guess what? She didn't experience it. But she was a contemporary. She was born the same year in the same state as my dad, but she was born into a town versus my dad was from a ranch. And afterwards, I started to ask my mom, gosh, you know, you guys were married over 47 years. You never shared any of this information. She said, no. And so I think it was a blessing in disguise that they didn't share information about where their families were in this difficult war, in this difficult time period, because maybe I wouldn't be here. So you'll find out more as we get into the story here. So 2 young families. So my grandfather ran what was a family heritage ranch. It's called Rancho Las Cruces, and it still is there today. It's smaller than it was originally when he was there. And my grandfather, it was about 2,200 acres, and it sat at the crossroads really of a northwest and east-west and north-south roadway in Jalisco. Los Altos de Jalisco is on the east side. It's closer to Guanajuato than it is to the coast, because Jalisco goes all the way to Puerto Vallarta on the Pacific Ocean. And my grandfather ran this heritage ranch, and it's been in my family for over 400 years. And so at that time, he had a family of 4 when the war started. My other family, my mom's family, was based out of Ocotlan, which is in the Bahia region of Jalisco. And it's just maybe an hour away from Atotonilco, because I have a couple of folks here in the audience whose family originate from Atotonilco. And so it's a beautiful place. It's really where you see the rich red clay of the land, along with the striking blue-green agave and the plants that grow a lot of tequila. And the clouds are spectacular. So it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And so the families then are young families. My grandfather and my grandmother were, really young, like in their late 20s at this time. And then my grandfather on my mom's side was a little older, and he had 5 kids. But he already had teenagers at this time when the Cristero War started. So it's about 2 really young families trying to survive this civil war. So setting the stage. So let me tell you a little bit about what was happening in Mexico prior to this. Pre-1900s, you had the church really educating the kids. They were on point to provide the education. As a matter of fact, the government was paying them about, some folks say about 10%, but they were paying folks to then teach the kids. So they were getting instruction, and it was about being morally and ethically right. Maybe they weren't talking so much about the Catholic religion, but it was a way of life. Folks would congregate at the churches, and how many of you have been to a city in Mexico and you can't believe how many churches there are in a town, right? It's like every other block may have a church. And so it was a way where people would congregate, they would meet up in the morning, they might meet up in the afternoon, and the bells would ring every maybe hour on the hour, every quarter hour. As a matter of fact, what you find in Aranda. So it was a way of life. The Mexican people, about 90% of them were Catholic at this time. And then you might ask, well, what happened, right? So we get this, you get this feeling that it was about the culture, the religion was ingrained in the culture, and the way families were raising their children. The government, the Mexican Revolution ended in 1917, and so they rewrote the Constitution of Mexico. And when they rewrote it, they actually built into the Constitution some anti-clerical laws. But the thing is that the presidents maybe weren't enforcing those anti-clerical laws until we get to 1924. So again, setting the stage, I'll be talking about the president's economics, the people, the priests, and the federales, because there's not one group, there are not two groups, there could possibly be 4 or 5 groups that were involved in all of this. And so let's talk about the presidents then. So President Plutarco Elias Calles came into power in 1924. Does he look familiar to anybody? No? I'll share a story later that happened that just fast forwards everything here.
He looks like Andy Garcia.
Well, somebody did, who was it? Ruben Blades actually, I think, played him in the movie For Greater Glory, right? So he comes into power in 1924. Before that time, he was governor of Sonora. And before that time, he was involved in the Mexican Revolution. And so one of the premises, I believe, is that the folks who got into this war still had a bone to pick with the others from the Mexican Revolution. So they kind of got into this Cristero revolution or rebellion because of what had happened in the past. So his name, he was fatherless, although he did have a mother, and his name really isn't actually his name. His name is taken from an uncle of his that maybe raised him or just wanted to give him the right to have a father's name. He married Natalia Chacon. He fathered 13 children. He was one of the creators of Mexico's banking system, and he was one of the founders of Mexico's political party known as the PRI, P-R-I. The rumor was that he didn't have a birth certificate, and his nickname was El Turco, meaning the Turk. People felt that he was not from Mexico, but from another country. And little by little, when he came into power, he started to enforce the anti-clerical laws on the books. He ended up at one time evicting all the priests that were foreign-born. He didn't want them in the country. He didn't want any influence on his people, on the Mexicans, wherever they were. And so if you could well imagine that the first seminary in the Americas was built in the 1500s, and it was in Mexico City. And from there, you have all kinds of folks come to study, and Mexico had been ingrained in being very, very Catholic. And to kick out foreign-born priests, that might mean that your diocese didn't have enough priests to do everything. There's some that didn't even have a priest because of that decision. So little by little, he started to chip away at the religious freedom that the Mexicans had. He also had a communistic flair in him. And the first embassy I had read that Russia established outside of Russia was in Mexico City. And he had invited the emissary of Russia to be there with him during his reign, and I call it reign. And she noticed pretty quickly that it wasn't really of the communist thought, that communism is where you take from the rich and redistribute to everybody, make everybody equal. And what he would do is he would take from the rich and keep for himself, and she called him out on it. And right after that, she was not there any longer. So he's a really kind of interesting character. He and I also share the same birthday, September 25th. Fascinating, huh? Okay, economics. So at this time, Mexico was very agrarian. They really depended on agriculture. They had just started to get into petroleum. And the petroleum area is located not necessarily in the center of Mexico, but over towards the east, closer to like Monterrey and that area. And during Gaius's stint as president, there were some difficult talks with the U.S. And I've even read so far as finding out that there could have possibly been a war over petroleum between the U.S. and Mexico at that time, because they were in disagreements, really huge disagreements. So, Mexico was just barely turning into then the 20th century of economics and what would play into their GDP. Their world influence, well, they were kind of a sleepy country. They had just won their independence in the 1800s, and then in 1917 they had ended this bloody Mexican Revolution. The banking system was just getting started, and so therefore then you see that they're starting to develop maybe into the economies, right, of what everyone else had. And then you get to June, July of 1926. So as I've told you that Gaius starts to carve away and chip away at those freedoms of the Catholics, he then orders what's called Ley Gaius, which is a penal code. And what Ley Gaius does, or Gaius law, is that it created the impetus to remove all freedoms from the Catholic Church. And if there was any worship that occurred that wasn't sanctioned by the country, by Gaius himself, that it would be gone with. And what he did was he met with the Catholics in Mexico and said, you all can exist here, but it's going to be under my rule. You cannot teach a sermon unless it goes by me. And you must get married. That's what he mentioned to the priests. And you report to me. So it kind of sounds familiar, because that's what Henry VIII created in England when he created the Church of England. Gaius was after also a church, a state-run church, and he wanted everything to be cleared through him and the government. Well, what do you think happened? The Catholics said no. The priests said no. We're not married. We take the oath of celibacy. We report to the Pope, and no, we don't clear our sermons with you. And at that time, then, it set the stage for Ley Gaius to step in, and Gaius to step in and say, well, then we deal with it all. It now means war, and that's what actually happened. So July 31st of 1926, less than 100 years ago, the Mexicans throughout the entire country were in church celebrating their last, possibly ever, church service. The churches were packed that day. It happened to be a Sunday. There's picture after picture of everyone either on their knees. Some of the churches didn't have benches in them. People just swarmed to the church because they knew this was it. Because the Vatican had declared, you know what? We have to protect our people. We're closing the churches August 1st. So July 31st was in. Everybody then said, we don't know how long this is going to be. We are going to go and worship and then figure it out later. So the churches were locked and closed August 1st of 1926. Not only in Mexico City, not only in Atotonilco Alto, not only in Arandas, all throughout the country of Mexico. And there's 26 states. And you figure, wow, this is huge. Why don't we know about it, right? I'll tell you maybe why we don't know about it. So here we go. So Mexico's people, the Catholics, I mentioned that about 90% of Mexico is Catholic. Back then, they were. This is the culture they were all raised in, right? There's also Jewish, and then there's also Christian or born-again Christians there. But the huge majority of folks were Catholic. And this gentleman here is part of the Cristero. So let me back up a little bit. So the Catholics, my family on my dad's side was very, very Catholic. The ranch known as Rosa de Castilla, where my grandfather was born, not too far away from his ranch, there was a church on it. My family lived with a church right on their property because this was the old heritage ranch. The very, very old. When the Españoles came over and they settled in Mexico, in this area, that's the ranch that they had. And so when you have a church on your property, that's pretty significant, right? So you're celebrating baptisms, you're celebrating first communions, you're celebrating marriages. This church that I went to, this is where my grandfather was actually baptized, and he was born in 1896. So you get this real feeling that it's just a rich culture for the Mexicans. So you have the Mexican people who are really up in arms when the churches were closed. What are they going to do? The church goes underground for 6 months, and then in January of 1927, 10,000 men rose up. They didn't have one leader. They had leaders like this general who just said, that's enough. We can't live the way we are. We can't live without our religion. The priests didn't have a job because the churches were closed, so they went underground, and folks were they were experiencing church, but in an underground church, hidden. They would have mass at 4 o'clock at somebody's house down the street, and the priest would come in, not dressed like a priest. Maybe he had grown a beard, his hair was longer, he just didn't look the same. But they were trying to keep the religion alive until January 27. And 10,000 men rose up all over Mexico, but for the most part they were in the states of Colima, Jalisco, Guanajuato, and Aguascalientes, kind of in that central core area. Zacatecas possibly too. And so this gentleman here is known as El General Victoriano El 14 Ramirez. And El 14 was his nickname because folklore had it that he was able to kill 14 men with one gun. He then is from Jalisco, from the area of Los Altos. And the interesting thing about this picture is this is just a second generation photo. when I noticed this same photo in a book that was published by Jean Meyer, a Frenchman, known as La Cristiada, back in like the 70s, this photo was in there. And I stopped and looked at it, and the book was all in Spanish, but I really centered in on this photo saying, what is up with this photo? I feel like this photo was taken on my grandfather's ranch. So as I was doing the research, you know, I'll segue into that, into this little offshoot story. As I was doing my research for those 2.5 years before I wrote the first word of my book, I took this large La Cristiada book down to Mexico City. So I wanted to show my cousin, look what I found, you know, this is the holy grail of this whole, you know, Cristero rebellion. And I said, and this photo, and I told her what I felt. Was it taken at her grandfather's property? She looks at the photo and looks at me and says, seriously? He was on your grandfather's property. He actually took it as headquarters. So chances are that this photo was actually taken on my grandfather's ranch, Rancho Las Cruces, because the night that the Cristeros, the uprising, the soldiers, the Catholic soldiers, stood up and said, enough of this to the government. This is war. They burned City Hall down at Arandas, and then they show up on my grandfather's property that night and take it as headquarters for almost the next 3 years. So this gentleman actually represents those photos that a few of you shared with me about your grandfather and what they were dressed as, right? So you see that they have a lasso. He's ready for war, but he's on a horse. And yes, the war did take place on horses. The advantage to the Cristeros is that they had young men fighting for them. This gentleman I had the opportunity to interview. His name is Juan Lopez Mares, and he's from Arandas. When I got to talk to him in this photo, I think he's 96. He then joined a priest who stepped out of the priesthood to fight. And the priest is named Padre Pedrosa, Aristeo Pedrosa. And he was one of 2 known priests who then left the priesthood during this time and fought with the Cristeros. They risked everything because as a priest, if they were to pick up a gun, the Vatican had told them, you are excommunicated once you do. If you survive this, you'll never be a priest again. And that was the seriousness of it. And so this gentleman and his brother, who was 2 years older, fought with Padre Pedrosa. Now, he and his brother actually survived, and my grandfather was maybe about 10 or 15 years older than him at that time. And so he had just this wonderful story to tell. But they show up as Cristeros, as Catholic fighters, with whatever they had. So if they had horses, they'd show up with a horse. If they had a gun, they'd show up with a gun. If they had a machete, they'd show up with a machete. If they had a rifle, they'd show up with a rifle. They weren't outfitted to fight a government force, but they certainly had it in their spirit that they wanted to fight because they wanted their religious freedom back. These are some of the photos that you find either on the internet or in some of the books that have been published. But you see how they may not look like a battalion, like a group, right? They're in their white outfits, which were called calzones. They're very sheer, like linen, because it's really warm there, very humid during the summer. And you can see that some of them have big crosses on them, right? Big hats. Some may look indigenous, and yeah, there were some indigenous tribes that actually fought as Cristeros. But you see that there could be, like the man standing next to this one in the larger hat. He looks a little older, and so does this one here. But maybe this little guy here with the rifle in his hand looks like he's about a teenager, right? Maybe about 15, 16 years old. And so it was where if you were 14 or older, you were taking sides. And parents would bless their kids and they would be off. Or it could be a father and a son team that would be fighting this Cristero war. So these are the Cristeros. You also had others who were Catholic sympathizers, and this is my grandfather. This is Juan Munoz Alvarez del Castillo. And this photo was taken, I believe he was in his late 60s, possibly closer to his 70s at this time. But he had a handlebar mustache. He was very distinct looking, right? A lot of hair. He was 32 when the Cristero Revolution happened. And he was the father of, at that point, when it started, his daughter had just been born, like a day before. And you know what happens in Mexico is that you baptize the children pretty much right after they're born, within the next couple of days. Well, she was born at the start of the Cristero War in 1927. So he and my grandmother take this infant daughter clandestine to another city to get her baptized overnight in the early morning hours. And when they come back, the Cristeros are already on his property. And so he's very much a Catholic, but I believe he swore to his wife, to my grandmother, and his mom that he would not take up a gun. And that's probably why he lived to be 99. So he was a sympathizer. He would feed the men, El Catorce's men. Rumor had it that El Catorce was the last one to eat. If there was some beans at the bottom of the pot and they were burned and there were some scraps of tortilla, that's what the general would have. But my grandfather made sure that they were fed, that the horses were fed, that they were clean, that if the horses had suffered any kind of injury while out, running through Los Altos or, in battle, that they would actually then take care of the horses. They had to be veterinarians, right? And so this is my grandfather. He also then played a role in that he protected the Cristeros when they were there. And he at one point hosted a federale. As soon as the Cristeros had left, you'll find this in my story, at one point the Cristeros had left, and then he realizes that the men coming up on the road are not Cristeros. Why are they returning to the house, he's thinking, a ranch? And they were federales. The federale general asked my grandfather, "Hey, Mr. Munoz, what side are you on?" My grandfather answered, "Well, it all depends." Federale says, "What do you mean it all depends?" And my grandfather answered back pretty quickly. He says, "Well, you show up with guns. The other guys show up with guns. It all depends on who gets here first." He won so much favor from that federale that my grandfather was one of, I don't know how many people, but just a really small, probably handful of folks that actually had a passport that would gain him access to travel during the Cristero War. He could go from city to city because he could show this passport, and this passport said this man is not a Cristero. And it was issued by the government, and that's the only way you could safely get from city to city on the main roads during this time. Pretty fascinating, huh? So we also had others that were involved in the Cristero Revolution, as I talked about, continue to talk about Mexico's people. You had the Catholic Young Men, the Young Men's Christian Association. The group that you actually see as the main group at the beginning of the movie For Greater Glory. Remember, you saw the younger men with the suits and the nice shirts, and they had ties on and all. They were from the lay Catholic group. They were the ones that were championing some of this, but they were not necessarily involved with a gun. What they were doing was lending support, raising money, protecting the priests who were going from house to house to still celebrate Mass underground or in large open areas like a ranch. They would show up there for Mass. And they were involved in making sure the communications was flowing through, whether it was to General Victoriano Ramirez and his group or the other groups that rose up. Remember I told you 10,000 men rose up in early January 27, and they weren't attached really as like a huge force, but they were in a way because of the young men's group. There was also a women's group as well. They were called the Joan of Arcs, at least one of the groups was. And their whole thing was to maybe run ammunition, to run food out to the Cristeros, because if they were out past the ranch somewhere else out in the country, how are they going to eat for a couple of days, right? So the women were really part of all that as well. And then there were others. So in my research within the last, like, say, 10 years, I've had the privilege of interviewing local families whose grandfathers and other family members were involved in the Cristero Revolution. And Yasmin Robles, I know she was going to try to make it here, and I don't necessarily see her in the audience, but let me focus in on her and on Juan and Carlos. So Yasmin Robles found out that her great-grandparents had this magnificent hacienda, but it was located in the area of turmoil during the Cristero Revolution. They had found her grandfather, who was a Cristero, very young at the time, in his 20s. The Federales captured him and held him for ransom because they knew this family had money. And so the family had to, just garner up a lot of money to go and then get their son. And as they went to hand in the money to retrieve him, they found out that he had been killed. He leaves behind a young wife and a 2-year-old son. The 2-year-old son ends up being Yasmin Robles' father. So he was raised fatherless. And then so there were some repercussions in the family because of that. So that was one story. Juan Garcia, let me see if I can take this pointer out here. There, okay. Juan Garcia came to me after listening to some of my interviews, and you could find them on KDTV. They should be on the front page of the website. And it's about the Cristero Revolution. So I must have about 8 or so interviews there, local people. And so Juan Garcia contacted me and said, hey, I'm really fascinated about this. I have found out that my dad was a military cadet during that time. So if you listen to that interview, this is about a Federale family. Juan Garcia is probably in his 40s now. His father was maybe in his 50s when he had him. Really late in life. Juan finds out that his father was a military cadet and was a real sharp mind, and he was used by the Federales to go scope out and try to plan and strategize the Cristero War, but for the Federale side. This is a local man. And then the last one here, Mexico's nuns, Carlos Lecia Baron. Carlos was raised in Cuba. And you might ask, how does a young man in Cuba know about this story? So Carlos's mom and dad were professionals. His father was an attorney, his grandfather was an attorney, and his mom was a school teacher. So they were people of means in Cuba. This was before Castro. And they ended up then sending him to Catholic school in Cuba because they could pay for it. Carlos then is befriended and really shares this wonderful story with one of the nuns that was his teacher, and the nun started sharing the story about the Cristeros. The reason why the nun knows is because their order was kicked out of Mexico during the Cristero Revolution. They end up in Cuba. And so that's how he knows then the story from somebody who went through it firsthand. Fascinating how you find people just in our neighborhoods here that have heritage back to the Cristero Revolution. So then the federales. So I tell you about what was going on in the government. One of the main players is the president. Then you have the Cristeros. You have both the freedom fighters and then the sympathizers. I didn't tell you about the church though, so let me go back. So when you see the young men and possibly young women who were involved in the Cristero Revolution, you're asking yourself, what is the church doing? So the church is scrambling. They're trying to figure out, we have just lost our freedom here in Mexico. What are we going to do? When the president declared ley calles, he then, established this is the way it's going to run here in Mexico, and the Vatican decided to close the churches, right? But you're thinking, what happened to the Catholics? What happened to to those from the Vatican? So they were in hiding, but they were trying to figure out how do they keep the religion alive. So they end up then changing a few things. They end up then allowing the Catholics in Mexico and the priests to shorten the Mass. Make it shorter than what it was, because they want to make sure that if they're celebrating Mass, they can quickly get out before the federales get wind that a service is happening. They then allow for priests to go underground, to stay as priests, but not supported by the church, but supported by the people. And so there is, when my grandfather finally moved off the ranch and went into Arandas, the house that he was in had a fake wall. And some houses had fake floors. And it would be that if the federales had found that there was a priest there, that the priest could actually hide from the federales so that they wouldn't be found. Why was this so important? Because the federales didn't care if you were a Cristero or not. If you looked like a Cristero, if you looked like a Catholic, they could take you in. If your house celebrated a Mass, they could confiscate it. The government actually confiscated most, if not all, of the churches in Mexico. The churches now in Mexico are held like museums where the government owns them in the land and the church just celebrates in it. The priests also and the nuns, their right to vote in a political election was taken away and was not returned until the year Felipe Calderón won office, just in 2006. They were given their right to, if they were Mexican born, they were given their right to vote again. It's really incredible, right? So I didn't talk about, then what happens to the church, but this is what was going on. Okay, the federales. So there were government families, and there were military generals, and this is a photo of, I'm in the brown dress there, and I'm standing next to my Tia Chuy and Tío Pancho. And my Tío Pancho was mayor of Ocotlan back in the day. This photo was taken in the late 70s, and he had served as mayor, but he was a federale man. He was a government official. And in the city where he lived in Ocotlan, it was a federale town, meaning that the plaza with the flagpole was flying the flag of the government during this time. People knew that that was a hub where the federales were. So heck, if you were a Cristero, you better stay away, right? And so each faction had either a town taken for them or not. And so in Ocotlan, this was one of the main areas, and that's actually where the general of the federales was located as they were fighting in that area. His name was, he went by Z Martinez, and I believe he lived in Atotonilco El Alto after this, so love to talk to you folks a little bit more about that. Some of the federales were believers. So if you can imagine, they were fighting for the government against the Catholics, but they were Catholics too. What a dichotomy, what an oxymoron. You know, what was going on in this community, right? As the churches were confiscated, the seminaries were confiscated, the convents, and you're starting to see just the power of the federal government in this war. What happens too is that the federales had ammunition because they could gain the ammunition. They could, you know, they had their rifles. They even bought horses to make sure that their men could fight, you know, where the Cristeros were going to take them in battle. And they bought airplanes, possibly to bomb the people. But they bought planes from the U.S. at that time. And so you see that the federales were really equipped. When you look at their outfits as soldiers, they look like soldiers. They look like they belong in an army. They're outfitted from head to toe. And they have the horses, but they may not know the territory. They're not sharpshooters, right? And they don't know how to ride a horse. And so they were really at a loss when it came to fighting against the Cristeros. And do you know what? During the war, the Cristeros were winning battle after battle. But people did die. And so when the federales would find you, whether you were out fighting or in a street or just outside of town, because they were patrolling the roads, right? Federales were patrolling the roads, so were the Cristeros. But if they were to find you, do you think that they'd take you in to jail and keep you there and you'd have a jury trial? You'd be found guilty or not guilty? No way. They would kill you right there. They would either line you up by firing squad. They could hang you. They would just not have to deal with you anymore. And so that's the kind of war this was. History says that there was about 90,000 people that died if you add up all of it, both sides, Federal and Cristeros. I happen to think it's over 200,000. This is the map of Mexico, and as you can see, each state is in color. And so the family from Sonora, Sonora is right next to the U.S. border, but their family were involved in the Cristero Revolution. Mine were actually down here in this state. This is the yellow that points at Jalisco. And this lake here is the largest lake in Mexico, and that was Lake Chapala. And they are northeast of that, about 2 hours drive, closer to the beige peach color Guanajuato. And so these are the states of Mexico. When I told you that all the priests didn't have a job, that meant everything. Everybody from Baja California Norte all the way over to Quintana Roo and Yucatan. No priests were allowed to celebrate Mass except for being in the underground. So that's how large of a swath this war took place in. So I talked about passports. The federales also have horses and trains and airplanes. They sent their people to reconcentrations. My family was sent away from their Rancho Las Cruces twice during this war. The men were allowed to return a couple of times. Why? Because it was harvest season. And the federales then declared a truce. Ceasefire for the time being. We need you men to go back and do your harvest. Isn't that incredible? So the men were allowed to then go back and, get their crop. Then a few months later, then the war was back on. Because it was still an agrarian society, they were growing all their crops. They needed that to feed all the people. And so the reconcentrations happened where they had come to my grandfather's ranch and said, we know you're helping the Cristeros. We want you to get out. And you have to leave now. And so the families then went to León, Guanajuato, and lived there for about 6 months. And that was not once, but twice. Actually, there was a third time where my grandfather then went into the small house that the family did own in Arandas. You know, it was a heritage house. And so anybody from the family could stay there. That was like a vacation home. But he went there one time. But twice they had gone to León. These stories are not necessarily shared, are they? The GDP during the war fell over 30%. What do you think would happen if our GDP in the US fell 30% in a couple of years? We'd be probably back at the Depression, right? And so this was really a very serious time for the country itself. Education. Didn't really talk much about education, but you know, when we talk about the Cristero sympathizers, and one of the things Calles did when he was president, before this whole thing happened, is that he told the teachers, but I did tell you that the teachers, that education was important and that the government had given the Catholics some money to teach the kids, right? So at this time, then Calles also goes to the teachers and said, if you want to continue being a teacher, you are a federal government employee now, and you have to take the oath of anti-God, and you have to share it with your kids. And if most of the teachers were Catholic, what do you think happened? Many of them left. They created homeschools, and my grandfather on his ranch then had a homeschool for the kids. Not only his kids, but the kids in the community. And they would all come. He had a teacher come in on Monday and leave on a Thursday. So the teacher had 3 days off, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, would return again on Monday. And it was a one-room schoolhouse, probably a quarter of this size, just something on the property. But you see classes taking place outside, and there are photos during this time when the kids were learning on small chalkboards, and they're dressed like ranch kids, and they're learning about school, but not in a government or a federally run schoolhouse. That's amazing, isn't it? So, the Constitution of Mexico at that time allowed for presidents just to be elected for 4 years. And Calles came in 1924. He was leaving in 1928. The war was still on. It was still moving. And Victoriano El 14 Ramirez was still fighting. Padre Pedrosa was still fighting. The gentleman, General Enrique Gorostieta, that was in the movie For Greater Glory, the storyline in the movie doesn't tell you much about who he was, but you find out, that he then is leading the Cristeros. He was paid to lead. They raised money to find a leader, the Cristeros did, possibly through the Catholic connections and the Young Christian movement and all. He was paid to lead. He wasn't a Catholic, but he was somebody that came from the Mexican Revolutionary War. So possibly somebody who still had a bone to pick with others. He then fights as the general at that level, a strategist, but the federales find him pretty quick and kill him. You don't necessarily hear much about that. He didn't serve a year or two. He served like maybe months as the general at that time. So here it is, 1928, and Mexico needs to get into an election. And who decides to run is really interesting. There is a professor from UNAM, University in Mexico City, named Jose Vasconcelos, who throws his hat into the ring. The next person that throws his hat into the ring is Álvaro Obregón. Why is Obregón so important? He served as Mexico's president from 1920 to 24, just before Calles got into office in 24. There was a rule on the books that said you could run as president of Mexico for 4 years, but it can't be 2 consecutive terms. So he decides enough is enough. This war has to end. I'm in it, and we have to find an end to all of this. We need to restore our country. And he gets nominated for president of Mexico. This is 1928. I'll stay here. So Alvaro Obregón is a friend of my family, but what side? My mom's side. He has a house on Lake Chapala. My family had gone there a couple of times for different parties. You know, he was a man well-to-do. I believe he had a house in Ocotlan, and possibly even a relative. But he gets elected in 1928 as president. Mexico has their elections in July. They don't see it until December. So from that point, you know, forward, there's a lame duck president, and somebody's coming in December 1. So Obregón gets elected, and 3 weeks after his election, he's assassinated in Mexico City. And Mexico has no incoming president. Other things going on too, I want to tell you about Natalia Chacón. So she is President Plutarco Elias Calles' wife. A year after, I should have probably inserted her earlier, but I'll talk about her now. Natalia Chacón has 13 kids with Plutarco Elias Calles. She is a devout Catholic lady. Devout. There's even a photo of her as with her daughter who's getting married in, it looks like, if it's not the Basilica, it is the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City. And next to her daughter and the daughter's husband-to-be in this service is Alvaro Obregón, who's in as best man, looks like, you know. And they're kneeling at the altar part. So Natalia is very Catholic. She has sent some of her daughters to Catholic convent school, and she's married to this man who loathes the Catholic religion. So a year after Ley Calles goes into effect, she dies. And the country is left without a first lady, but her older daughter then steps in and takes those official services as the First Lady of Mexico. Also, too, when Calles told the Catholic Church that they needed to report to him, that sermons had to run through him, etc., and the Catholic Church didn't buy that, he goes ahead anyway and sets up the Church of Mexico. He takes a rogue priest and creates then a papacy in Mexico City. And that church was still around a few years back when I visited Mexico City, because I saw this very old church on one of the streets in Mexico City. We drove right by it. And I pointed to my cousin. I said, "What is that building?" You see people walking through, you know, and it looks like a church. And she then looks at me again, looks at that, looks at me, and she said, you know that man that you have in your book? That is the church that he created, the Church of Mexico. So that's going on at the same time. And then the one-way tickets. So the federales were trying to find a way out without getting embarrassed, because they had been losing battles. They start offering the Catholics a one-way ticket. Where do you think to? The U.S. Who said the U.S.? You're right on. The U.S. They start to say, you know, if we can't beat them, we're not going to join them. We just got to get them out of here. And so they started to offer these one-way tickets to emigrate out of here and leave. So all of that to say then in the end of July, Mexico doesn't have a president. Calles then appoints the next one, and his name is Emilio Cortés Gil. And Calles finally realizes, well, we need to come to an arrangement, an agreement. So we are now into the throes of 1929. Emilio Cortés Gil comes in December of 1928. And they're trying to fix this thing. They're trying to, just deal with this war. And it's called Los Arreglos. It's an arrangement. It was done in June 1929. It was brokered really heavily by the U.S. ambassador to Mexico named Dwight Morrow. And Dwight is also in the movie, plays an important role in the movie For Greater Glory, if you've seen that. So he's one of the tall gentlemen, and what's striking in that movie is that he is moved by when he's taking a train ride and he sees the Catholic men, the Cristeros, hanging from telephone poles, dead. And he realizes this is what the landscape looks like. We need to do something about it. So June 21st, 1929, the agreement was signed, and it was signed by representatives from the Vatican who were there in Mexico City, who were the leaders of the church in Mexico City. It was signed by the government of Mexico. And it was really a three-way deal, although the agreement was between the Catholic Church and Mexico. So the federales, the Catholic government, said, hey, so we need to end this war. What we'll do is we'll leave the laws on the Constitution the way they are, but you know what? We won't enforce them. We won't enforce the persecution against the Catholic Church. And you can reopen your churches. And the Catholic Church, those representing the Vatican, said, okay, that's fine. I think we can live with that. But then there was a caveat. The federales said, you, meaning the Catholic Church of Mexico, you have to tell the Catholics to lay down their weapons. Well, the Catholic Church said, no, we're not going to tell them to lay down their weapons because we never told them to pick it up in the first place. You're going to have to go back and arrange that with the Cristeros yourself. So this is the part of my book that gets really interesting. I won't tell you what happened, but leave you with that. So who won? So you may ask yourselves, who won? Did the Catholics win? Did the federales win? Did the people win? So the people had their church back. They could celebrate Mass. They could celebrate baptisms. They could the priest could offer communion. They were back to serving in their churches, not, in an underground church in someone's house, where the priest would carry in his vestments in a suitcase somehow and get dressed there and make it short. So they had all of that, right? The federales then had men who were trained to fight, but they didn't need to fight anymore because that was going to be off limits, right? And the Cristeros who won, well, you might say maybe they won. The Cristeros could go back to their lives, except for those couple of priests that stepped out and they could never go back, right? And so you had it where who won this war? And you might say, and we know that history books are written by what? The winners? Well, in this case, I don't believe the winners actually wrote the history. I was able to look at a 4th grade history book from Mexico that was given to a grade schooler. And this was a few years back, about 10 years ago. Imprint by, a Mexican-based publisher. And it was a book that was shorter than 11 and a half. So it was probably till about here, right? A little journal book. And if you could picture a page, 2/3 of the page was about the Cristero Revolution. 1 page in this history book of Mexico. Most of that section was taken up by a photograph, and maybe there were enough lines for 2 paragraphs underneath talking about this war. And what it basically said is that in 1926 there was a disagreement between the Catholics and the federal government. And there was a war that took place, and in June of 1929 they came to an agreement to settle the war. Basically, that's what you got. So I don't believe history was written in this case by the winners. 900,000 people died. I speculate it was many more, over 200,000 in all. And there was a conditional winner. Conditional to who was in charge. To this day, the churches belong to the government. This is me in Mexico City, Zócalo, which is the main plaza there. Behind me is the Federal Palace. This is where, everything took place, where the president was, etc. Now they have some really nice modern buildings just a little outside the central part of the city. And this was taken in 2007. My book, part of the book, the story is actually set there in that presidential palace. But we fast forward then to November 2007. That was still 12 years ago, right? I ended up in Mexico City. Oh, it was October. Okay, November. That was... so in 2006, Felipe Calderón won the office. And the current president now is Manuel Andrés López Obrador, who actually ran back in 2006 and won and lost that to Calderón by a slim margin, slimmer than what Gore lost to Bush, slimmer than that in Mexico. So he's still harping on the fact, AMLO is still harping on the fact at that time that he's the real winner. So he sets up his own government and appoints people and all, but he's not the one who was sworn into office. And so I'm there the following year, and he's still, blasting away that he's the rightful president. I go to Mexico City for a wedding, and it was my niece who was getting married. And the wedding took place on a Saturday, and then on Sunday we decide to, travel to another part of the city to go visit another relative. And as we're coming back through the city in the afternoon, it must have been like 5 o'clock or so. And there are all these tour buses that have Andrés Manuel López Obrador all over them. All over the downtown streets, they're parked. And so he's having a State of the Union address. The guy who did not win is having a State of the Union address in this Zócalo. We don't actually go into the Zócalo. We're around the streets seeing then, this hullabaloo, right? Didn't think anything of it, went to the house, settled in for the evening. The next day, I wake up a little late. It's about 9 o'clock. And my cousin looks at me and she says, take a look at what's on the news. What had happened that Sunday at the State of the Union address is going to shock you. Is that as they were speaking, the church bells that sit in front of me at the Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City start going off in the middle of somebody's speech. The speaker then says, go tell the church to knock it off. Fanatics of AMLO, who are there for the Zócalo, go storm into the church. There's a service going on. They disrupt the church service. They knock over some parishioners. They cause havoc. The Cardinal of Mexico was out of the city at that day, that morning. When he comes back and realizes what had happened, he then sets closure to the church in Mexico City and tells the government, look, you guys are supposed to take care of us. You're supposed to protect us. Why did this happen? And if I don't get some answers and get an understanding that you are going to protect us here, I'm going to start closing all the churches till the whole country's churches are closed. And on the news that morning, I'm watching this, and they are going back to the Cristero Revolution when the churches were locked and closed. And I'm sitting there saying, history is repeating itself, and I am here in Mexico City. And so it took them about a week. The federales just started backpedaling a lot, and it took them about a week to come to the understanding that, yes, we're going to protect the churches, and, they are government property and all. But this happened in just the most recent years. How true is the story? It is pretty true. They take and look at the characters of what you would find then in the Cristero Revolution. And Andy Garcia then plays Gorostieta, who was actually then killed a couple of months into his leadership role. He's wearing a big cross, but he's not a Catholic. This is really important too, is I believe that you and I have this rich heritage that we carry from our ancestors. And what I have come to find out is that Mexicans who were born in Mexico, who may be 80 or 90 years old, possibly remember this. They may have not fought in the Cristero Revolution, or they may have not had family in the Federales, fighting, but families had to take sides back then. And they may say, yes, I think it was my grandfather, I remember a neighbor or an uncle being involved in the war. Those that were in the war have probably all passed on, because just a few years back when I was there were maybe a handful of people who were celebrating some of these victories that the Cristeros had in these different little towns and villages around Jalisco, and I got to witness some of that. They had a horse parade one day in the town of San Julián in Los Altos de Jalisco. And we came upon the parade area, but we had been stalled on the roadway about 30 minutes because they were doing construction. By the time we get in, there's no horse parade. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, we missed it. No horses in the city whatsoever. Stopped at the Zócalo, which is the main plaza. There's a church right there. Start speaking to a gal who owns a shoe store at the corner. And then she starts telling my cousin, yeah, my grandfather was involved in the Cristero Revolution. And I'll walk you over to the priest who's over in the church. Come with me. The priest is, as we're walking closer to the church building, the priest is coming towards us in a shirt like that gentleman right there with the hat on. Just a plain plaid shirt. Doesn't look like a priest, carrying a bag with his computer in it. And she introduces him to me, and he says, I really can't talk right now. I'm going to go celebrate this mass with the horse parade. So wait a minute. I'm looking for the horse parade. Where are you guys going? And he says, we're going to go to this church way out in the boondocks. Just follow me. And so I drove the car behind him, and it was a dirt road, not even paved, out onto Cruz de Orozco, which was a small little church outside of a little village. And all the men, as we started approaching closer to the church, all the men were riding in, honoring the Cristeros on their horses. And this is part of the celebrations that happen every year in Mexico, where they're still trying to honor their heritage. So I say that, those that fought in the Cristero Revolution probably have all passed on, because this happened, just less than 100 years ago, but a long time ago. The kids, the youngest kids were probably 14, 15, 16. They're no longer around. When I saw that parade, there were about 4 men who were honored as being part of the Cristeros. And they were older, and they were in walkers, and they just couldn't ride horses anymore, much older men. And so then you get to the next generation, and those between like 60 and 70, they might say, I think I heard. If you ask anyone here in this city or throughout this region who's like in their 20s or 30s, they're going to look at you and say, what are you talking about? Because the heritage stories have not passed forward. And it could be that the Catholics maybe didn't think that they won, and so they're not going to maybe talk to their families about it. The Federales may not think that they won, and they may not want to talk to their families about what happened then, because each family on every block, you either had to really identify as a Catholic or a Federale, as part of the Cristero side or the Federale side. And then there are fundamental considerations. So what would you do if you were told that you could live, but you had to give up your faith? Would you fight for your religious freedom? And that's the question that I want to leave you today. Thank you very much. Yes,
Oh, El Jefe?
El Jefe. El Jefe. So remember when Gaius was only serving 1920 to 24? I'm sorry, 1924 to 28. And Alvaro Obregón, the previous president, was going to then come in 28. He gets assassinated. Emilio Portes Gil is sworn in as president, kind of handpicked by Gaius. The reason why he was handpicked is that Gaius, once he leaves office, he doesn't leave office. He appoints himself Jefe Maximo, the emperor, the boss of Mexico, and appoints not only Emilio Portes Gil, but 2 other presidents following him. Gil doesn't last for 4 years. None of these men last for a term of 4 years, but Gaius appoints them. Why? Because he is still the puppet master of Mexico. Gaius was exiled out of Mexico because Mexico had enough. And it was during the 1930s that he was actually kicked out. And he came to the U.S. He was taken out of his bed in Mexico City, and he was put on an airplane and taken to Texas. And he ends up then doing a news conference from Texas. And I don't see this, I see him, I hear his voice, but this, where when I got to the broadcast, it was actually on a PBS story about the Mexican Revolution, not the Cristero Revolution, but it does talk about a significant man during the Mexican Revolution, which was Plutarco Elias Gaius. He then lives in the U.S. and gets to go back to Mexico, but he then, like within 6 years, he dies. Very, very interesting. But he was called El Jefe Maximo. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
I've been hearing recently that China's has a pretty active movement going on against any religions, which is similar to your story. And I'm wondering if China has their government seems to be in the economic way pretty active all over the world now. But I don't hear about too much Chinese activity in Mexico, is there?
So there is a faction of Chinese that actually live in Mexico City. And back in the day, my dad, who lived for a short time in Mexico City as like a delivery person, he ended up saying that he recalls the Chinese having these fabulous coffee houses, and they were still around back in the 90s when I went down to Mexico City with my dad. And there is a Chinese faction within Mexico. As to being, communist, I don't know. But certainly countries deal with persecution in different ways. And this is just to highlight that this was a significant war in Mexico about religious persecution of the people. Mexico in these days is about 60 to 70% Catholic, so they've still held that majority. But many of the folks you might consider, many of the folks that are elected may not be so strong in terms of that. Alvaro Obregón, and then there was a previous gentleman who served as president, they said that they were believers. But when they saw persecution, they maybe turned their back on it. They didn't enforce it, but they didn't stop it. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, I have a journal back by the goodies and soft drinks and all. And if you wouldn't mind leaving me your name and your email address and possibly your phone number, I'd love to keep you abreast of when the book is coming out. I am working with a couple of people to actually then get the book published here soon. And it is about both sides of my family and how they found themselves on the opposite sides of the war. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to present the certificate of appreciation from the museum. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
I have heard maybe 5 of these, and they're all, they keep getting better and better.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you.
Now, this is for contributions. We get nothing from the city except for the lights. So if you put some money in there, that'd be much appreciated.
We are self-supporting for our own contribution.